Welcome into the Inside Bassmaster Podcast, episode 100 and something, Kyle, but is the first one of 2023. I'm excited to kick off the year, and it's weird to think that, it's the first week of January, and we only have about 4 more weeks until we get into the Elite Series mode because the kickoff event at Okeechobee starts about the second week of February, so I know anglers will be in that mindset over the next 21 to 28 days, and thankful for you to be my co-host today on the podcast. And our special guest today, we always start out each month with the pattern of the month segment. And we like to think about fun places to fish, warmer places to fish. And that's the theme this week, Kyle, when we have Bernie Schultz in to talk a little Florida fishing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm looking forward to it. So Bernie and I have done a good bit of just talking fishing with no real strings attached, just talking fishing. So I'm certainly looking forward to getting to ask him some questions, talk about Florida fishing, something that I personally like, and I think a lot of people that are listening, have always wanted to go fish Florida, have never done it, kind of would like some information, things like that. And obviously with the Elite Series season, I guess a little over a month away from kicking off in Florida, definitely the perfect person to get some insight from. So Bernie, welcome to the podcast.
Appreciate it, guys. Good morning.
Well, Bernie, the thing about January is there's a lot of things happen, especially in Florida. Tournaments start up, and that's normally a place, whether it's Texas or Florida, we start tournament season there. But a lot of snowbirds like to make their way down there. I know I'm going to rag on Charlie Hartley. I know he's got himself a spot down in Florida that he stays because it's much better than Ohio in January. And so that's just the state where it seems the most life happens quickest. But we do know January can be a little tricky with cold fronts. One thing that's interesting about Florida fishing is we start to think about the spawn, and every time we have an elite event in February there's some form of the spawn about to happen. But in Florida, the spawn truly can start, especially South Florida, maybe Thanksgiving, maybe a couple weeks before Christmas. And it's not a warm-up that we need in other states for the spawn to happen. It's normally a cool down, correct?
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, I've actually caught fish in Okeechobee. It's kind of an anomaly itself. I've caught fish in Okeechobee in September that had roe in them. But the spawn can definitely be going in November and December down there. It just all depends on the weather, the water temperatures. Is it stable? Then when we get a few fronts, that can change things dramatically. It can push the spawn back to as late as March, April, sometimes early May. But it's a unique, that waterway is unique in that regard.
And that's one thing that I've always, I guess I never really even thought about it till I got to like high school, somewhere around in there. But, you grow up fishing somewhere, let's just say Arkansas, for example, or Alabama, where I live now. And you get in this mode of like the fish aren't going to spawn. It's not going to happen until at least March or April. And Ronnie and I've talked about this. Most places it inevitably happens in April, no matter how bad people want it to happen in March. But, in Florida, like you said, that time period is significantly different than anywhere else in the country. There's really nowhere else that, even in Texas, it's still like significantly further normally than Florida. Give me the perfect scenario, because I remember, in 2019 at Palatka, everything set up perfectly as far as the weather trends, the water temperature. Like, what is your perfect scenario, like as far as water temp, warming trends, things like that, for it to just, be outstanding?
Well, I like a couple of cold snaps beforehand and kind of get the water temperature down so the fish start thinking about spawn or spawning. But when it gets close to tournament time, the perfect scenario for me is cold right up maybe the week before, and then a steady warming trend leading right into the competition days. If we don't get violent weather and too much wind, it doesn't, that would possibly roil up the lakes where the water gets where you can't see. That's never a good thing in Florida. Florida bass are sight feeders by nature. That's their primary way of feeding. So when the water gets dirty, that makes the spawn challenging. I'm not sure they even spawn when it gets bad like that. I think they just wait or look for areas that are protected. But to answer your question, Kyle, basically 4 to 5 day warming trends to stable conditions and not a lot of wind.
Yeah, it seemed like that we were very excited from, I love hearing tough practices in Florida when we do the dog talk stuff with you guys, because I know that if it is getting warmer, everything that everyone just said about the Monday through Wednesday does not matter. And it's going to be a wide open ball game because someone could roll around a reed head and there's 31 pounds waiting for them right there. Bernie, but the thing is oftentimes there are multiple waves of fish. When we get a wave of fish in Arkansas, that first wave, there's going to be a fish on every bush that's possibly spawning, or, at Norman and in North Carolina, it could be under every single walkway on a dock that they're spawning. But there's so many waves of fish. You'll have fish spawning from before Thanksgiving till May in Florida, and obviously it gets considerably less in May. But how many waves do you expect Florida to receive spawn wise? And where's the prime time? I mean, should we start our season the first week of December in Florida to hit the prime wave, or is it the third full moon or the second new moon? I know that those are things that also contribute to it as well.
Yeah, it's the moon can definitely factor in. I don't think it's as determining as the weather, a warming trend, stable water temperatures like we just discussed. But definitely the moon can trigger them, a new moon, a full moon. And to answer your question on the number of waves, man, every year is different. Sometimes there's one huge wave with maybe a secondary small wave. Sometimes there can be 2 or 3 waves that are all about the same. Those stronger waves, the earlier, tend to bring the bigger fish. And those are the ones like at the St. John's or Harris Chain the last few years. If we landed on those first wave spawners, you saw the results, when we did land on those first waves. So it varies. It varies just like they do up north. I mean, you think the conditions are right on a reservoir, a lowland or a highland reservoir, you think the conditions are right, timing might seem right, but for whatever reason, they don't go off. And then a week later, here they come. So it's never really predictable. There's just some indicators that you try to follow.
Before, I was going to say, Kyle, on that same train of thought, what is your thought and opinion on the Harris chain last year? You were in that group of anglers.
Exactly what I was going to bring up. Exactly.
There were so many fish in that Banana Cove area, but an island and a nice spawning area normally, but they weren't spawning. Were all those fish heading to spawn or coming from the spawn? Because I thought it was going to be a 130-pound tournament to win because of how good the Harris chain's been. And we see like 4 dudes in the top 10 who made a living sight fishing. Everyone else wasn't sight fishing. And it was kind of confusing because the moon was there, but there were so many fish in that Banana Cove region. Were they on their way or on their way back?
They were both. That was a huge staging area. It's one of the few places in the lake that had healthy grass. In previous years, the grass was more distributed throughout the Harris chain and especially in Lake Harris. So there were other areas that were hot given, the staging process. But in that event, it seemed like the best grass was either there or in the very extreme end of Little Harris. But the conditions weren't right for Little Harris. The water was dirty. It just wasn't set up right. And that's what condensed so many anglers in that Banana Cove area. There were so many fish coming and going. I did sight fish part of that tournament. I had a really pretty good, it wasn't a great day. I had almost 20 pounds over in Griffin the first day, but it was such a slow process. I mean, my whole morning was non-productive until the water temperature came up like 4 or 5 degrees. It was like I couldn't buy a strike. And then all of a sudden it was on. And about the time I had to leave, I caught my 2 biggest fish, 1 7-pounder. So, I didn't have that luxury the next couple of days. I was in the last flight. As you remember, those flights were really drawn out to late afternoon. And so I didn't have that luxury on day 2 or day 3. So I kind of just had to get in with the crowd and catch those leftovers.
Yeah, I remember covering you. Actually, I guess it would have been on day 2 in that area. And I just remember thinking like, this is a madhouse in here, because it really was. I mean, me and Ronnie actually just talked about that the other day, but there were so many boats in such a small area, it seemed like. But that kind of leads me into my next question. This is a kind of a general question, and we can kind of take it into parts. But, once again, going from, somebody like myself or anybody else that's like aspiring to try to fish professionally, things like that, you know, you're going to have to fish in Florida, or when you do, it might seem kind of foreign, right? So in my mind, it's kind of the same way for, you hear a lot of guys talk about like the White River lakes being foreign because it's all just rock. There's no, you know, it all looks the same. It's rock, yada, yada, yada. Well, in Florida, a lot of times it almost seems the same, but with grass and vegetation. Somebody like myself that grew up fishing in Arkansas and these White River lakes would go down there and be, you know, more or less lost. So when you go to, you know, a body of water in Florida, like what is this time of year, obviously in January, what are some things to keep in mind, places to start, just things that you need to like keep in mind right off the jump to have success?
Well, this time of year, you better have some protected water. You know, our lakes are shallow for the most part. Definitely in, you know, relation to northern reservoirs, they're very shallow. On average, the depth is less than 10 feet everywhere you go. Lots of 2 and 3 foot water. So the wind can impact the fishery in a big way. And like I said earlier, the fish are sight feeders. Even when they're spawning and not really, you know, feeding per se, they bite better when they can see what they're after, you know, or whatever's in, you know, in their territory and they want to defend it. Things to look for, just, you know, protected water, weed edges where there's transition from one type of grass to another, or a mixture like bulrushes or flat reeds mixed in with maiden cane, or say lily pads mixed in with a field of pepper grass or hydrilla. I mean, wherever there's a mixture of vegetation, you usually have a better shot. It's a salad bowl, and it takes years of experience to really kind of weed through that stuff and eliminate it as quickly as possible. You know, with 2.5 days of practice, it's challenging for guys out of state, especially. And if we're in a cold front situation, you can fish right over the top of a productive area and never realize there's fish there. They just don't bite sometimes. I mean, Florida's known for dead worming. It's just where it got its start. So you got to fish glacial speed. I mean, super slow at times to just get a bite. And so my suggestion to anybody coming here is to try to pick areas that are protected. Regardless what the weather does, you'll have a place. Like on Okeechobee, for instance, I try to find fish on different sides of the lake to combat whatever direction the wind's blowing. That's true for the Kissimmee, you know, other parts of Florida where we have these round dishpan lakes that are, you know, pretty much shallow flats for the most part. And then just try to define those weed edges, you know, whether it's a big field of grass, just look for differences in the grass that, you know, or edges, whether it's an inside edge or an outside edge. You know, be conscious of the edges and the seams where one type of grass transitions to another.
I think it was directly related to Okeechobee. I don't know if it was on Bassmaster Live or we were talking to a Florida angler, but they described Okeechobee when there's wind like a dinner plate with a little bit of water in it. If you have enough to cover the whole plate in water and you just tilt it just a little bit, and that is the wind blowing one direction or another, it can raise the water level on one side of the lake a foot or two compared to, and it dropping out in another. So yeah, that makes sense to spread yourself far to have options, but then you got to be a veteran and not just run around Okeechobee because it's not the easiest place to do so. One thing I wanted to throw in as well is people think when you cross the Florida-Georgia line there, that it's like a greenhouse effect, that the same thing's going on in Tallahassee as it is down in Okeechobee or Clewiston. And that's not the case. I mean, we can fit, it is 200 at the widest point, it is 240 miles from the top of Arkansas to the bottom. And that is basically what it is from Palatka to Okeechobee, Florida. You could fit an entire state between St. Johns River and Lake Okeechobee. So what's happening at Okeechobee may not happen for another, what do you say, 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month at the St. Johns River, and they may completely be done with what they're doing at Okeechobee when they even start up there.
Yeah, that's spot on. That's true. You know, conversely though, I've seen the north part of the state go off before the south. It's weird how it sets up down here. Florida stream bass are unique, as you well know. You can put them in another habitat like California, Texas, wherever, and they're probably the slowest to bite in cold front conditions wherever they are, but they adapt, and it's just hard to predict what they're going to do, Ronnie. it's hard to just hand somebody a checklist and say, here you go, and have it produced. It just doesn't work that way. But you're right. The south end of the state generally is first, and it creeps its way up through the latitude to the northern part of the state. But where I'm at, I consider Gainesville, where I live, South Georgia. I mean, it's cold here right now. We're in the 30s this morning, and down in Okeechobee, they're probably in the 50s, upper 50s. So there's a topwater bite going on down there, and up here they're probably slow worming, Texas rig worms, just trying to buy a strike. So
ice fishing.
You really don't know what you're going to get.
One thing I was going to mention, so this is obviously I kind of want to make it a two-part question, because I want to get your maybe top 3 to 5 baits that you would take to Florida in January. But also, like, before we even get to that, one thing I want to mention, what has always seemed to be true, and you can maybe hit on this, is like each part of the country has like their own separate like baits, colors, things of that nature, where it's like that works. Like using the White River example again, like, a wigglewort, I don't know where you'd use a wigglewort in Florida. I mean, there might be a place, but like it's so specific to that area as where you get in Florida, and there's baits that are so specific, baits, colors. It seems like it's like a whole new world down there in some regards. And a lot of that, from what I've always understood, maybe you can explain this better, is because of the water color and the tannic color of the water. So your colors like June bug, I've always seen like spinnerbaits being all gold, things like that. Explain why those colors and, why these specific instances are true in Florida and maybe not in other places in the country.
Okay, with a spinnerbait reference, gold is good because we have golden shiners. It's a primary forage in Florida. Roland Martin kind of made it famous with the Okeechobee Special, big blade spinnerbait with big gold blades. It's not to say silver won't work. At times it does. We have shad also.
Sure.
But gold generally is relative to the forage, the shiner, golden shiner forage. With worms, natural colors, for whatever reason, June bug's always been a staple in Florida. Grape kind of preceded that, black grape. Back in the 60s, 70s, early 80s, that was the go-to color, black and blue, and straight blue, or sometimes blue with chartreuse tails. That's old school. That kind of evolved into June bug and Okeechobee craw colors, and all these weird colors they got now. But I can tell you, green pumpkin's still pretty solid, and watermelon as well. Watermelon red's a good color in Florida. But to me, they're natural colors. I don't know what lives in nature that mimics that June bug color other than a June bug, but subsurface, I can't imagine anything that looks like that. But they eat them, and it's just been proven for so many years that those are primary color choices, and they work day in and day out. As far as 5 lure choices, got to have a prop bait. I'm gonna start at the top of the water column and work down.
Sure.
Okay. You
sure.
gotta definitely have a prop bait. Tandem prop, slow moving baits, usually the best.
That's what you mean. You mean like a prop bait as in a devil's horse, not what people may confuse as like a plopper that has like a prop on it. It's more of
Correct.
a straight, slender, pull, stop.
Yeah. Slow moving, again, almost glacial speed at times. Some of my best days topwater fishing is with the lure just sitting still. People have the tendency to want to fish the bait too fast. They want to hear those props churning and sputtering, and it's fine on the initial cast to get the attention of the fish, but once you think a fish is zeroed in on the bait, you're almost better off not even moving that bait. And yes, to answer that, devil's horse or the Rapala X-Rap prop's a good bait.
Yes.
I helped design that bait with Mark Fisher, and a former icon in Florida. He's passed away now, but Doug Gilley gave his input on that design as well. And it's a great bait. There's not a pro that has been to Florida that doesn't carry one. If they're not, they're missing out. But anyway, poppers are good. There's times when a popper can be good. I'm using the Shimano Whirl Pop now, and had a lot of success with it, both in fresh and salt water. So a popper can be good. And again, it's a slower presentation. It's not like, sliding and spitting the bait like Zell Roland made famous. It's a slower presentation, super slow at times. And buzz baits can be good. You know, there's any number and styles of buzz baits. Clackers are usually good over grass, and slower squeaker type buzz baits are better when you have more open water, you know, thin grass or no grass. You know, that's around wood is usually a squealer is better. Okay, and so the next bait would be a jerk bait. I'm going to plug the one I like right now. It's really good. It's kind of a hybrid between some established baits, and that's the Shimano World Minnow. It has a lot of cool things about it. It has the flash boost feature, which basically looks like the bait's flashing even at a standstill. It's also got the jet boost feature for long casting. Got a great action. It's good in cold or warmer water. You can do a lot of things with the bait. And right now I'm catching fish with it in Florida. Any number of jerk baits can work, but that's the one I'm using right now. Crankbaits. Can't go to Florida without a lipless crankbait. You got to have a lipless crankbait. It's good around grass. It's good in open water. It's good on schooling fish. It's a staple lure. Whether you're in a river, a lake, or a pond, you need a lipless crankbait. Chrome and gold are primary colors, but there are others. You know, bleeding shad, shiner, those kind of colors are good too. And billed crankbaits, square bills and round bill crankbaits can also work, especially in rivers, creeks, canals, or in deeper water situations, or around docks and wood, like cypress trees, you know, that type of wood. We have a lot of that in Florida, and so crankbaits can work there. Spinner baits and chatterbaits and swim jigs, I kind of group those together. Those are all deadly. Depending on the day, one can be better than the other, but it's important to have all three of those. And then when you get to the bottom, you know, it's slow moving baits. A jig can work in Florida. It's had times when it's been very productive in tournaments, especially, but for the most part, it's the lights just went out. That's weird. The slow moving Texas worms or wacky worms, Cincos, those type of things, those are really good. So it's important to, yeah, we lost power here. I hope, there it's back. You know, so that's kind of the top to bottom thing. You definitely want the top waters, the subsurface baits. I'll tell you one bait that you can't overlook, and I've been doing a lot of damage with it lately, and that is a paddle tail worm that you can swim like a speed worm. Yamamoto just came out with their version of the Speed Cinco. It's a you know, same formulation as the Cinco, but it has a paddle tail. Yeah, what I like about it is you can break the tail free. There's a little line with a connecting couple of tabs on it. You can break that tail free so that it's more of a swimming tail rather than a thumping paddle tail. And I've actually, you guys just published a video I did on bassmaster.com using that bait and caught a lot of fish on it. So you definitely need a speed worm when you come to Florida.
That kind of the speed worm we saw it play at the Harris Chain Summit, it kind of seems like that is the crankbait when there's too much grass around. But whereas we've seen an actual crankbait factor at St. John's, in the lock and canal areas, like you said, around docks and things like that. But when there is actually grass present, it seems like it's the best version of a moving bait that you can have is that swimming worm. Bernie, yeah. I do have a question for you. Have you gone down to Okeechobee? What's it like since the storms that hit? I guess it was Ian hit the Tampa region and probably affected somewhere. One thing that I know, I'm in a group chat with a bunch of guys who fish Okeechobee religiously, so I won't say anything that you wouldn't know, but you fished Okeechobee longer than they've been alive. But one thing that Okeechobee seems is that it's water level. Its water level is a big impact of they're always saying the numbers, and I don't remember them off the top of my head, but you know, it's like, oh my gosh, it's high, it's at this number. Oh my gosh, it's dead low at this number. Moving water is a big deal at Okeechobee. So is that a factor for you when you think about January fishing? When you think about programming your mind, is making sure some lakes you don't have to worry about it, but some lakes you need to check what that water is at, because it could add an extra 2 or 3 feet, which, like you said, if there's only 10 feet in the lake on average, that's 20%, 30% more water in certain areas of the lake than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, I just got back from Okeechobee. I spent a couple of days down there. It was kind of disappointing, to be honest with you. Ian definitely roiled up the lake for a while, but more damage to that lake has been done by indiscriminate spraying. I hate to get political here, but there's just too much spraying going on. There's vegetation that belongs in that lake and they're eradicating it. And I'm not talking about invasive species like hydrilla. I'm talking about peppergrass, eelgrass, pondweed, naiad. There's a lot of pond type grasses that are natural to that lake that are no longer in areas where they used to thrive. And those are the filters that I talked about earlier that improve the water quality in other parts of the lake, that give the fish a chance to spread out and the anglers with them. And we don't have that now. They've sprayed that lake to death, and it's really a tragedy, to be honest with you. It's so frustrating. I know the businesses and the people that rely on that fishery are extremely frustrated. They have town meetings about it. They try to meet with these agencies. They think they're making progress. Still, they're spraying the lake to death. I did a 180-degree pass around that, 360 degree, however you want to say it. I went all the way around the lake. Places that used to be really well protected and had the filtration from the grass no longer have that. So a lot of that water is basically non-productive, worthless, dead water. And what that does is, where there is good water, it condenses the fish and the fishing pressure. The lake's high. It's not flooded, but it's high, and it's probably going to come down by the time we get back there. But I wasn't impressed. It was really frustrating. I've been fishing that lake for 50 years now, and it's just so discouraging when you think you're making progress. The lake's trying to rebound, and then they give this full-on assault to spray everything and kill everything in sight, and the fish just, they suffer as a result. It's going to be a tough tournament, and I'll tell you why. Because so much of the water is worthless now. There's probably 2/3 of the lake that otherwise would be a factor won't factor in. The places that are clean and productive and healthy, they're going to have a ton of pressure, and it won't be just from our guys. It's a destination this time of year. They're in their full swing of their tourism down there on that lake, and there's a lot of boat traffic on Okeechobee right now. If you catch a fish, you're going to have company. If somebody sees you catch a fish, you're going to have company in minutes. It's frustrating. I'm sorry. I just got back from there, and that was my experience.
What's one thing?
The bent rod pattern's everywhere, but it seems to be in Florida, down in that area, just about as much as anywhere.
Yeah, especially when there's limited water to access or be productive in.
What's the one thing that you think, if there's one thing that over the next month could dramatically help fishing? Is it a huge warm front where it's warm the whole month? Is it where it gets a little colder and then has a chance to come back? Or is it just no rain, holding off on the rain? Because, a lot, like you said, water clarity is a big deal. But also, if we do have, some of that sunny skies and warm conditions, it has some things able to maybe grow and form from now to then, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, stable conditions.
Stable.
That's critical. I mean, to clear up some of the sections of the lake that I'm frustrated by, it's going to take super calm conditions and let that stuff and the particles in the water settle and get in and offer some clarity. But right now, it's I don't know what can help it. If they'd stop spraying, it'd take 5 years for that lake to recover, and it might take some planting. I mean, they've really eradicated a lot of healthy grass. They point the finger at high water and hurricanes and all that stuff. Hurricanes didn't destroy the St. Johns River. There was a lot of spraying going on, and they haven't had healthy grass in St. Johns River for years now. Every time it tries to grow now, you have predation from turtles and manatees and whatever else eats grass. So it's hard for it to recover, and spraying's not helping. I'll get off my soapbox.
No, it's very important to know. I mean, we hear all those things, and we're thousands of miles away to be able to see that, and we know how important it is for some of these places that, the Kentucky lakes of the world, when one thing maybe affects it and it's been, overlooked for years, and one thing comes in and takes over, Now they're 10 years behind from being back to where it was. And so we understand that there's definitely a fight. We know Scott Martin's voiced his opinion on it and tried to be a part of the Clewiston area. And you're another Florida angler, but like you said, you've been around for 50 plus years fishing. So you've seen Okeechobee, you know, probably when it had its first Bassmaster event there to now when it's going to be 2023 and we're going to have an event there.
Yeah, I mean, it's the biggest natural lake in the South, and it's our biggest lake, and it's a travesty to me. There's so many people that survive off that lake and try to survive off that lake. Guides, businesses, you know, tourism is a big factor for the economy in South Florida. And when you have agencies that rely on funding, and if they don't use all that funding, they don't get it the next year. It's appropriations. And if they don't spend the money, they don't get it the next year. And that's where the indiscriminate spraying comes in. And the other problem is there's multiple agencies, you know, working all these fisheries in Florida. And they each have their own funding and they each have their own purpose, and they don't always mesh. And it's not been good.
Like what is, and I hate to go down this rabbit hole anymore, but what is even the thought process on why they would want to spray it? So like on certain lakes, I understand, you know, partially, like if, even as a bass fisherman, I can reason with the fact that it might be a big recreation lake, but a lake like Okeechobee, like I don't, you know, naturally think of it being a massive, you know, just recreation ski board or ski boat, like pontoon lake. Like what is even the thought process on that? I'm just asking out of curiosity.
That's funny you say that. In all the years I've fished it, I don't think I've ever seen a skier. I don't think I've ever, and I can't
like
say
paradise.
that about any other body of water in the country. And you don't see many jet skis there either. It's kind of an airboat, duck boat, and bass boat, and pontoon. There's a lot of pontoon boats. They like to spec fish down there.
Shiners and
yeah, but it's not a recreational lake in that regard. You're right. The reasoning, who knows? Every agency's probably got its own objectives. Part of it's navigation. Part of it's a fear of invasive species taking over and displacing natural species. And some of it, I don't know that they have a reason at all. I think it's all about money, funding, appropriations, and spending that money.
Bernie, I know, kind of segueing, but staying on that same pattern of a grass lake like Lake Okeechobee, does it not eliminate your advantage? Because Florida seems like it's a lake where, or Florida seems like it's a state where you do have a significant advantage if you know that state. There are some anglers who travel down there and struggle, and it takes years to get consistency down there or any kind of success down there. But Seth Fighter said it once, he doesn't have to practice at Mille Lacs. He knows where every boulder is, and unless someone scuba dived and took a shovel and dug up the rocks and moved them, those rocks stay the same all the time. Those rocks will be, he just needs to know if they're 15-foot rocks, 10-foot rocks, whatever it is. But in Florida, even if they didn't spray, just the natural progression of getting cold, water levels, grass will change and affect certain areas. Sometimes it might be thicker in a place. This weed line was really thick. This grass line was not. Now it's flipped. So a guy like Scott Martin, a guy like Kobe Krieger, somebody like you who's seen the lake in all different facets and forms, is there much of an advantage for you guys coming into this elite to start the season off? Because I know there's like 5 or 6 Florida guys and everyone's like, they're probably licking their chops. And I'm like, they're probably also sweating, because if you don't produce in your home state, you feel like you wasted that opportunity, you know, starting the year off on a good foot.
Well put. I mean, you know, Florida's always a challenge, even for the locals. The grass beds change. Okeechobee, it seems like I never catch fish in the same exact areas ever. I might be close, but something about the weed growth and where it is. You know, peppergrass can be in one section of the lake one year and then another the next. I couldn't find any peppergrass this trip. Eelgrass can be prolific and throughout a big section of the lake. I struggle to find any eelgrass this year. Lily pads or small lotus pads. That lake has a lot of those still, but the places I found them, they were really dense and shallow. I'm not sure the fish will use them, at least not in a large, in large numbers, probably.
Especially if that water comes down in the next month, then it's going to be really, really shallow.
Yeah, it could change all that. That's true. There's an abundance of reeds. The lake has plenty of healthy reeds, round reeds, flat reeds. There's plenty of stuff to flip. There's a lot of mats. There's smartweed, and some people call it alligator weed. There's an abundance of that. For the guy coming from out of state, it all looks the same. It's like the first time I went to a reservoir, like you say, it was all rocking, and where do you start?
Yeah.
So I started on points, and I'd work myself to the backs of the coves just to get in shallow enough water where I felt comfortable. And then as I progressed through that learning curve, I realized that, channel swings and structure were critical at certain times of the year. But, it's going to be tough, and it's probably going to be tough on Scott Martin, Kobe Krieger, Bernie Schultz, Cliff Prince, the guys down here that fish it. There's no guarantees, especially when you stack half the field in some key areas. It's going to be kind of who gets the bites, the timing, and if you're there first, or if you stick it out longer. There's so many factors. I look for it to be kind of a tough tournament.
Now, kind of segueing that off, more of a general Florida question. I think, when you think about Florida, one thing that's always said, especially this time of year, when the fish are spawning, thinking about spawning, that kind of thing, more than seems like really anywhere else in the country for the most part, is the perception is you need to, when you get a bite, a lot of times you basically need to work that general area for everything it's worth, because there's a lot of times there's more bites to be had. And it's really a lot of times not a time and a place to run and gun. I mean, you don't hear about that a whole lot. Kind of explain that and why that's so prevalent in Florida versus maybe some other parts of the country.
Yeah, you hit a really good point there. Case in point, the Harris chain last year, I told you I fished in Griffin the first day. I had the luxury of a late weigh-in time, so I could stay into the afternoon. I mean, I fished past 3:00. That's rare. I mean, there's a locking system and 2 canals that you have to idle a long ways through to get there from Lake Harris. And so that was weighing on my mind, but the later it got, the better the bite got. And I sat in one area. I mean, I never left that area. I knew they were there. I knew at some point they would bite, and I committed to it. A lot of guys, if they didn't have the experience in Florida to know to stay, they probably would have left and not cashed in on that. But unlike northern reservoirs, our fish don't school necessarily to their year class. Like in Florida, you can catch 31-pound fish and then catch a 10-pounder right in the same spot.
It's because he's feeding on those 1-pounders. That's the forage base for him.
Yeah, but I mean, our fish mix, and up north, it seems like you can get on a keeper pattern, then you can get on a 3 to 4 pounder pattern. You're going to get fewer bites, but in Florida, the fish mix. They're where the quality water is, the forage is. They're where they want to be, and it's just a matter of weeding through the smaller fish to get the bigger bites. That's so often the case down here. So, Kyle, you hit a great point there. It's it takes patience. If you're in a good area, you should stick it out.
Tell me about. We have a couple more questions before we let you go, but tell me about shell bars and those hard deals, because as lakes, especially in Florida, lose grass, or grass changes, or grass goes away, there's other structures in the lake that weren't as prominent. Maybe shell bars have been around for hundreds of years on these lakes, but they haven't been featured because there's been so much grass. Now that grass goes away at the St. John's, we see a lot of people, in the turns of the river on those where the current's going to push up hard shell or hard bottom in general. At the Harris chain, it's known that, at the mouths of those canals, that there's probably going to be a hard spot somewhere on either side of it. And it could be the winning spot like we saw in the College Series. It could be a non-factor for the most part for the Elite Series, just a month later last year. At Okeechobee, it's a bowl. It's not as current driven like the St. John's River, or current driven like the canals of the Harris chain. Are there some offshore structures there that can play out in the open water that don't have the protection, but their kind of protection is they don't have a lot of silt and sediment because it is hard bottom? So it may be a patch of clear water just in the abyss, which is very hard to find.
Yeah, there are definitely hard bottom areas offshore at Okeechobee, and the fish use them. Usually, it's a low water deal before guys will go out, venture out there to look for them. There's usually just not enough water on the bank to bring any quality fish or consistency to quality fish on the bank. I remember we had a tournament there years ago, and I think it was Mickey Bruce. I'm trying to think, one other angler did really well way offshore outside of Clewiston, like halfway across the lake out in the middle of nowhere, and they found rock piles. The Clewiston Cut is actually a dug channel for big boats to navigate from one coast to the other through Lake Okeechobee. And the Clewiston Cut is actually part of that. I kind of said that wrong. You go through Uncle Joe's Cut out of the Caloosahatchee River to get into the lake from the Gulf, and you exit the St. Lucie Canal to go to the Atlantic. But part of that dug system is the Clewiston Cut, and there are rock piles, in various places. Plus, there's natural rock shelves offshore. There's one a big one north of Kramer Island on the south end, and that holds fish in the summertime, especially, or anytime the water's low. But I got to tell you, the water was so turbid. I don't know if it's because of Ian or just the time of year or the fact that they've sprayed so much, there's just nothing to filter the water anymore. That offshore bite to me is really sketchy. I don't have a lot of confidence in that. I'm sure somebody that's unfamiliar with the lake will go out there and try their luck and probably find them and maybe win out there.
Like
but,
a 6XD or a DT20.
Yeah. I mean, it's not deep though. I mean, the most you're going to find out there is probably about 12 feet, unless you're in a channel somewhere. But it's, there's definitely a population of fish that live offshore, and it's a needle in the haystack because it's a big round bowl 20 miles across.
Basically seems like on Okeechobee, if it's deep enough to where you jump in and you don't touch the bottom and your head's still on the water, it's probably deep.
Yeah, you gotta go somewhere.
So one thing I did want to hit on. So I got to cover that college tournament last year at the Harris Chain where the kids caught the 36-pound bag, the Messer brothers from Kentucky Christian. That was really cool. And I got to see it in person actually on the water. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is finding those shell bars. I mean, on some of those lakes in Florida, it's not like graphing on the Tennessee River where you're just graphing certain areas and boom, you see a bunch of fish. Like, it's not necessarily that simple. Maybe for somebody that is not as familiar with that, kind of explain how, you find those shell bars.
Yeah, in the old days, schooling fish gave them away. Or if the school was down, you found them with the Carolina rig. We didn't have the sophisticated electronics to side view or look with a forward-facing sonar. We didn't have that. So you'd have to actually watch for surface activity, look for birds, look for, busts on the surface or boils on the surface where there was some feeding activity, watch shad skip out of the water or whatever. Nowadays, it's all electronics, and they're catching fish in places we never looked. Now, I mean, I'm not a pioneer by any means, but I'm pretty early in the development of bass fishing in Florida. And I can remember the guys ahead of me, Doug Gilley and the Adams brothers, and there's so many guys, back in the day. They did it by, following signs in nature, like those I just mentioned, and then they'd stay on them with crankbaits or Carolina rigs to feel the shell. And when they were in shell, they felt like they had a chance to get bit, and that's how they found those places. I guess somebody that was really good with a flasher, like David Fritz probably could find him with a flasher. That guy still carries a flasher on his boat. It's amazing. Talk about dinosaurs. But and I can say that because we're friends.
Hey, I think that I like how you said also you were early in the game. You're not saying you're an old guy. You just were early in the game. I like the way you phrased that. But Dave Lefebvre also ran a flasher years ago in the Elite Series, and I was like, what is this thing? So I was like, can I print off my Word doc from this? But I could not. So I have a question for you about that. A little bit of history. You're one of the wisest and most tenured guys on the Elite Series in general of fishing, probably professional fishing. There's probably 5 guys on your hand that were around when you started that are still around now. I mean, obviously we can go on for a whole another show for an hour about what you've seen changed, but where do you find yourself in the sport now? Because it's something that I saw an Elite Series pro the other day on Instagram. He posed a question thing, and fans and kids were asking questions, and said, how do you get sponsored? And he said, make yourself marketable. And I responded to him and said, how do you make yourself marketable? Because that's the one thing that's different these days with social media. Anyone can say that, hey, I have a reach, I have an influence. For someone who's a seasoned veteran of the sport like you, that's been around before social media, do you still find that the way you market has changed, or do you feel like the way that you've done things is so effective? Those handshakes, selling something to someone at an expo, those conversations, it's something that's still very, very valuable compared to just making a post on social media. So you've seen it both ways, and you have to balance both ways. What have you heard from sponsors, and how do you feel in your heart of hearts where you fit into the sport now in year 30, 40 for you overall?
Yeah, it's yes to both. I mean, handshakes are still important. Personal relationships with people in the industry. It's a very small industry. These young guys will figure that out as they progress. There's not a lot. I mean, people move around, but they don't go far. So you might be working for a guy at one company this year, and in a few years he's over at another company, and you're over there with him there. That's happened to me more than a couple of times. Social media, YouTube, yeah, that's huge now. There's an emphasis on that in marketing for a lot of companies. I question, it's kind of crazed in my opinion. I'm not sure how much those guys move the needle. I mean, you can get on YouTube and get a ton of followers, but how many of those followers are actually buying product?
Yep.
And if you're a wacky, somebody that gets out there and is pretty zany on camera and puts on a show, how many lures is that guy really selling? And how much is he really teaching the people that are following him? I'm old school in some regards. I still think print publication has, is a valid platform, and it has a following, and it's it's definitely waning. Digital has displaced it in a major way, but Bassmaster.com is a powerful platform, and it brings a lot of people into the sport. It keeps a lot of people on its platform because of the information, the amount of information is generated through there, whether you're watching tournaments live or reading columns by anglers like myself, or some of the stable of writers, the great writers that write for Bassmaster. Yeah, I mean, there's old school aspects that still apply, but there's this new generation and movement towards digital and digital age marketing. I'm caught between. I'm kind of stuck, and I'm on the backside of my career.
We're in between as well, and we're
Yeah.
just under 30 years old, but social. I mean, I didn't have social media till I entered college, and I was a little late to the game there. But it's still 10 years of my life compared to my 30-year life. So yeah, it's definitely a change.
I mean, I just got an Instagram account this year. That's how slow I am.
I'm proud of you for holding out as long as you could.
Well, it's in my contracts. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't do any of it. But I don't mind it. It connects me with a lot of people. It's a good platform. Facebook's a good platform. YouTube's a good platform. It's about getting the message out, messaging for your sponsors. That's the bottom line. If you're not effective at delivering the message, then your time's limited. I think the emphasis, and it was for me as well when I was young, there's too much emphasis on trying to secure sponsorship before you're ready. These young guys need to spend more time on the water and get their skill set broadened and with some depth to it before they start worrying about sponsors. I know that's tough, but man, guide or have another job, do whatever it takes to keep yourself on the water as much as possible. And if you get the breaks, the sponsors will come.
I think, Kyle, we can both speak to this, that I'll say back in the day, like I'm sitting on my stoop on my front porch as well. But like back in the day, you fished because you loved it, and then it became a job. People now fish because it's a possible job, not because they love it. So when it gets hard, when it gets there's a lot of more griping around. And I noticed that a lot. One thing I will say to Bernie's point is, the publication aspect, when you read something these days, I read to learn at times. You know, I'll look at a magazine article and I like to look at the pictures a lot. But then if the pictures entice me, I'll read it. But when I watch videos, it's often to be entertained. So people can learn from videos. I'll still YouTube how to start my lawnmower without a key when I lose my key. But it's all the things you can learn on those things. But definitely it's more entertainment, and the articles and the photos and things like that still teach to a great extent. But Kyle, do you have anything for Bernie before we let him go? I know he's probably got to go and teach some people at a boat show in a couple minutes.
I do not. I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to talk about Florida fishing and get off on the, a couple other topics, intriguing topics. And no, I just thank you for being with us, and appreciate all the insight.
Likewise, if whoever's watching this, if you'll follow my columns on bassmaster.com or insideline.net, just fishing in Canada, I write for those guys, and definitely follow me on Facebook and Instagram.
There, that's perfect. Bernie, we appreciate you. And we pray, me and Kyle specifically, we're not biased, but we pray for that you have a good spot to go to at Okeechobee, and that you have an early boat draw. If it's going to fish small, that's the thought and prayer from this episode of the podcast. But thank you for joining us, Bernie, on this episode of the Pattern of the Month for January. If you're heading to Florida, it can be very confusing. You pick out the same baits you maybe would in July. You just have to fish them much differently, like Bernie Schultz said. So we appreciate you joining us today, and we will see you in the next episode of the podcast.